Hello, welcome to the fourth program of the Oakland Public Library's Fall History Series. This October marked the 30th anniversary of the devastating Oakland-Berkeley fire. What began as a small brush fire in the hills on the Oakland side of the Caldecott Tunnel near the Parkwood apartment complex, the Oakland History Center invited a panel of speakers to recall the events of that harrowing day, but more importantly, to reflect on lessons learned and policies and practices we can implement to prevent such a disaster from happening again. I'd like to introduce you to the speakers, and they are Marge Gibson Haskell. She served Oakland as a planning commissioner, vice mayor, and council member representing District 1 for a total of 19 years. The entire 1991 fire in Oakland was in her council district. She lost the home that she was living in and a rental in that fire, both of which she ultimately rebuilt. While she was on the council, she worked to clean up after the fire, make the fire-ravaged area one that Oaklanders would want to rebuild in, and reduce the possibility of future fires. Marge presently is an instructor in American government at Berkeley City College. Henry Gardner has had a long and distinguished career in both the public and private sectors. He was appointed city manager for the city of Oakland at age 36 and has the longest tenure in that position in the city's history. He was named the most valuable city manager in the country in 1992, the year after the fire. In 2003, Gardner joined the staff of the Association of Bay Area Governments, an association of all 9 Bay Area counties and 101 cities. He has advised dozens of cities and counties over the course of 20 years. He is currently chair of the California Institute of Local Government. He is also the founder and past president of the National Forum for Black Public Administrators. Sue Piper retired in 2012 after almost a 50-year career in public relations and marketing. The last 8 years, she served as a policy analyst to Council Member Jean Quan for the city of Oakland, and then as Mayor Kwan's communications manager. A survivor of the 1991 Oakland-Berkeley Hills firestorm, she and her husband have dedicated the last 30 years to wildfire prevention and emergency preparedness. They created the Oakland Firestorm Memorial Garden and the Gateway Emergency Preparedness Exhibit Center under the Oakland Landscape Committee, and both served on the now sunset Oakland Wildfire Prevention Assessment District. Mark Hoffman, our next speaker, was born and raised in Oakland, a product of Oakland High, Laney College, and UC Berkeley. Mark joined the Oakland Fire Departments in 1980 and worked 38.5 years for the department. He rose through the ranks to the position of fire chief. He served in that capacity for 1.5 years. He also served as a principal officer for Local 55, the firefighters union, for 18 years. He was assigned as a division supervisor for Division D at the Oakland Hills fire, which was the area between Highway 13, where the fire jumped, and Hillcrest School.
And I saw smoke. I saw the smoke and I quickly speeded up the tires and took her, Debbie, back home, at which point I called Craig Koshin because I knew Henry was just about coming into town. Craig was also, but I could reach him on his car phone. And I said, Craig, I think you better meet me down at the emergency center in Martin Luther King. There's an enormous fire building up there in the hills. And it doesn't look like it's going to stop. At which point I left my house, not to ever see it again, and met Craig down at the, and other staff down at the Martin Luther King Emergency Center. And that was it.
What about you, Sue?
I saw it as I was driving back from dropping my twins off at a birthday party in Piedmont. I could see the smoke rising, and called the 911, and they told us not to worry about it. But as the sky got darker and darker, I contacted a couple of neighbors, and when my neighbor across the street told me, oh, maybe about 45 minutes to an hour after I first noticed the smoke, he said, it's crested the hill, get out now. We took his advice and left.
And what about you, Mark?
Well, my parents who lived down by the lake gave me a call. I lived up in Montclair, said, are you near the fire? I said, what fire? And then I went out on the deck and looked, could see the smoke, called our dispatch center, didn't pick up because I think they were swamped. So I got in the car at my normal fire station was Station 1, which was co-located with the Emergency Operations Center. So I reported the duty there, got put in charge of a couple tasks. And then I said, hey, how about it looked like a hiring hall. There were firefighters from all over the Bay Area showing up at our headquarters with wildland gear, structure gear, naval shipboard firefighting gear. Just it was an incredible zoo. So I said, how about I call AC Transit and get some buses, and we can start taking people up to help assist or relieve crews fighting the fires. And I put a guy in charge of putting together a list and said, put me number 1 on that list. And so that's how I got up to the fire. I took a bus up Broadway Terrace to the command post, which was right up by the market. That's I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank
Village
on the street
Market.
that cuts.
Village
Yeah, the Village
Market.
Market. Yeah, so that was where one of our initial command posts was set up. So we reported the duty there. I got assigned to a spare piece of apparatus that somebody commandeered from a firehouse, and we went to work.
Wow. And Steve, what about you? How'd you learn about the fire?
We'd been, I was working at the paper, and we had a lot of lessons from the '89 earthquake about how to deploy for disasters. And we got word that about the previous fire that they said that had been put out that night, and just because there was concern that we were going to have to come down and cover a bigger fire, but luckily the fire came out that was put out. We thought. I was living in North Oakland, and I went out to cut my paper, the Tribune, that morning, and suddenly I saw little pieces of burnt material falling from the sky. So I immediately ran down to the paper, and when I got there, partly because of the experience of '89, everybody was there showing up. We had a phone tree for things like this. Partly that was developed from the '89 earthquake. We decided we had to have a better response. And we didn't even have to use the phone tree because everybody when they saw this fire burning, they just all showed up. So we had people all over from all the whole staff was basically down there. And then our publisher was not. And so we were concerned about him. So we called his house, and it turned out that he couldn't leave because he had to stand on his property with a hose and keep the fire from burning down his house. His wife came down with the kids. A lot of people started coming with their kids who were evacuating from the area, who'd lived around there. And it became sort of we had our own sort of disaster relief station at the paper. It included members of the media started pouring in from all over the region, sort of like what Mark was talking about with the fire people. The journalists descended upon the building, very similar to what happened in '89 and from the earthquake. And I think having had that experience, I think it made us really much more comfortable with what we were facing, because it's always really hard to deal with when you know that people are going to be dying, and you're going to have to deal with grief and human emotion. So and then we saw from the building that very much looked like that photograph that Dorothy showed before, the first picture of the fire above the lake, and it became, it was terrifying.
So Henry, let us know what it was like for you.
I will be happy to share it. I was returning from a project in London, and halfway across the Atlantic, the fire broke out. As we were approaching the landing, the pilot said, "Oh, there's a big fire in Oakland." And I looked out the window and I thought, oh, that must be a fire from West Oakland, where there'd be lots of chemicals and things that could burn like that. And then as we got close to the ground, I realized the fire was coming from the hills. And I thought, there's nothing in the hills that could burn like that. Got to the exit, went through immigration, customs, and my niece was waiting for me, and she just collapsed in my arms in tears. And she said, "Uncle Henry, Craig," who was assistant city manager, she said, "Craig called." She said, "There are 1,000 houses burning in Oakland." I said, "Lori, that's ridiculous. There can't be 1,000 houses burning." Well, I went down to the command center where I met Craig, and we drove up towards the tunnel, and you could literally see the fire moving down the hill. And I said to Craig, "This fire will burn the city to the ground. It'll stop at the bay." And then, of course, when the fire was put out, my niece was way off with her $1,000 houses burning. And Sue will have to correct me because we had a little chat about that earlier. My recollection is that there were more like 3,000 substantial homes and 500 apartment units and 25 dead. Steve made this comment. He kept making references to the earthquake, and I just want to make a comment about that. The fire occurred almost exactly 2 years to the day from the earthquake. We were still digging out of the earthquake, and here is the second great, great disaster, which pretty much brought the city to its knees. But I've said many times that actually Oakland should have been named Phoenix.
Okay.
So at the time, what fire prevention measures were in place at the time of the fire?
I think that question
You
should
want-
go to Mark.
Yeah. Bottom line, well, when I was a kid in high school, I watched the same area burn up in 1971, I believe it was,
That's correct.
and watched the bombers come in, and went up and toured the areas like a looky-loo later. And coming off of that fire, the fire department got a little more involved in placing rigs in a good place, moving engines up proactively if there was a fire. But really, that was almost the extent of it. There was not a lot of wildland training that went on when I came in 1980. We had a few hill fires that we basically surrounded and drowned because we had good water supply. And as long as the fire was not too big, we could inundate it with water or deluge it with water and put it out. The problem is when you get into extreme weather conditions, when you get into materials that have overgrown, and that happened during the period of time between 1971 and when the fire occurred. It was just a torch waiting for a match to get burning. And we were ill-equipped in terms of our personal protective equipment. We were wearing structure equipment. Fortunately, a lot of the partner agencies that showed up to help us had wildland gear, CAL FIRE being one of the biggest East Bay regional parks. Some of the smaller departments that, Moraga, Orinda, they had wildland gear. We would have
Paradise.
loved wildland gear. We were running around wearing structure boots that have steel shanks that were conducting the heat out of the burnt ground and burning our feet. It was tough. And then our radio system was inadequate. The number of channels we could switch to was, we had like 4 channels we could switch to. So we were ill-equipped technically, training, equipment. We were ill-equipped to handle this fire. We had seasoned firefighters. Oakland's got some of the most seasoned firefighters, in the league. But when a fire gets to be that big, you need the pros from Dover to come in and manage it like a campaign fire. So even our reaction to use ICS correctly, we were limited in how often we fought fires using incident command system, which you really do need to have a structure in place when all the resources start showing up so you can put them to best use. And we were behind the curve on that. Fortunately, we got, like I said, the pros from Dover. Cal Fire showed up, very experienced with all the Southern California fires. Even the guys who were stationed in Northern California, many of them had worked in Southern California. They really saved our bacon, but then so did the weather conditions and everything else. We didn't put it out, it kind of went out. A lot of extra effort done. Fortunately, the conditions became milder and we got a handle on the fire for that reason more than anything else, in my mind. And it got down to things that were not as much the urban wildland interface. It got down into structures in Upper Rock Ridge, those type of areas, Broadway Terrace, and those homes, more stucco homes, more homes that were slower to burn, tile roofs, things that, you still had shingles, you still had combustibility, but you had some homes that you could defend more readily. So anyway, I think
I'd like to
thank you for that.
Yeah, I'd like to add a PS to that in terms of just how ad hoc the mutual cooperation was at that time. I was at the emergency center and I was dealing with the phones that were non-emergency because we had the emergency ones staffed, but the non-emergency ones I was dealing with by bringing in volunteers whom I knew were competent to handle, and I was getting information from the emergency center. Call came in. We're in Paradise. I said, what? They said, it's City, Northern California. I said, okay. Do you need help? I said, yes. But that came in on the non-emergency lines because they couldn't get in on the emergency lines and they couldn't get to the fire department itself. Anyway, I think we returned the favor recently.
One quick comment, Dorothy, we have not made. The fire chief, Lamont Ewell, had been at his post for 13 days.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
What,
I don't think anyone was faulting him for not getting a better handle on
He
that.
was still trying to find the men's room. He had been on the job 13 days.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah, that
and
was
since,
very much a welcome to Oakland kind of shock to the system for sure for him.
Yes.
What are we doing today to mitigate wildfires in the hills? How are things changed? Mark, you talked about equipment and responses. Marge talked about, the mutual aid help that we were offered. What today is happening as far as mitigation activities?
I'll run with it initially. And thank you, Henry Gardner, for bringing up Lamont Ewell, probably one of he's a deity in my mind. He's, he was the guy who brought us into the 21st century a little bit early. He got us equipment, he got us funding. I mean, it was probably aided by the fact we burned up a whole bunch of town, but he had a vision for where we ought to be as a fire department, and he got us well on our way to getting there. We got to where we started to be involved in the regional aspect of fire suppression more. We started to attend trainings. We started to train for the incident command system. We had things, it wasn't just Oakland was behind the curve. The county in general, now we have a number we can call immediately, and they will take it away from us and start, not the firefighting, but will take the overview and the getting the resources coming. They will take charge of that for us and take it off our our plate, so we don't have to worry about it. We can worry about saving Oakland. We went into a radio system, the 800 megahertz radio system, that allows us lots and lots of channels and interoperability. We've made a lot of improvements with the equipment we wear, the training we received, playing with others, vegetation management. It's not perfect, but it's so much better than it was.
But I think I would like to add here that we don't want to leave people with a false sense of security. We're lucky we haven't had a fire in 30 years. This area tends to have fires every 20 to 30 years. But that doesn't mean another one's not coming. It is coming. We just don't know when. And we're better off than we were, but we've got a long ways to go. The fire weather has changed, as we've seen from 2017-18. The climate change has made it windier, hotter, drier. So the fires there are more of them. The winds are much stronger. They push embers further. So it isn't just the fire and the embers burning in the wildland urban interface. They can go beyond that, as we saw with Coffee Park, which isn't even in, it's
We're new to it.
It's not there. And we're seeing fires not just being ground fires. I think so much of what the standard for vegetation management over the years has been to create defensible space by clearing ground fuels, because they figure that's where the fire will begin. Somebody will drop a cigarette or something like that. But given the kind of winds we're having now, the embers can start fires wherever there's vegetation. So you have to look at your crown fires. You have to look at your trees and how far apart they're spaced and what kinds of trees. Some trees are more likely to burn than others. So the maintenance factor has gone up geometrically. And there's a lot to do. It's responsibility of the people who live there. It's the responsibility of our local cities. It's the responsibility of our counties. It's everybody has to work on it, because the fire doesn't care who owns the property. It goes where the fuel and the wind takes it.
The amazing thing about what Sue is saying is that it's this natural terrain, natural environment that has to drive the politics. And the fact that we are managing right now to ignore the Monterey pines, which are in the end of their useful lives. Monterey pine is good for 75 to 100 years. And after that, it just dies. And we have a lot, as a matter of fact, that are dead crowns right now. And looking at our eucalyptus, which are getting big, shaggier, and creating more of a potential risk as they do, because in many lots, they've just never been cleaned up under or even cleaned. We need to have the kind of political will that will come back in and say, yes, we do need to take charge of these areas. We do need to move in with more districts that are set up to actually do nothing but clean up these areas and go after them. We've managed to vote down major initiatives that would fund this kind of cleanup. And so the result is that to do this stuff, to become fire safe, we are competing with every other kind of need that the city has. We have no priority. We have no claim to a priority as it stands right now. And if we want to be fire safe, we've got to establish our own funding for this in order to have a political claim to being able to get money for it and know that that money is going to be used that way. It may require an independent board that can say, we will control the money, it goes just for this. I don't know what the citizenry wants, but we darn well better start looking at it and figuring it out.
And some things are actually happening now. There's an effort that's been started by wildfire prevention advocates, such as the Oakland Fire Safe Council and the Claremont Canyon Conservancy and Make El Cerrito Fire Safe. We've spent the last almost 2 years trying to get the concept of a East Bay Wildfire Prevention Joint Powers Authority established. This would cover the wildland urban interface communities in Western Contra Costa County and Eastern Alameda County, basically along the East Bay Hills. And I'm very happy to say that we were able to get 40 or 50 consumer groups, including the Sierra Club, to endorse this, and about 30 or more elected officials from these different counties and cities to endorse the concept. And we are about to have our very first meeting at the end of November or early December with representatives from about 20 cities, 2 counties, the non-municipal public agencies like East Bay Regional Parks, PG&E, Caltrans, and other groups, all of whom own land in this area, to hammer out the details of what a joint powers authority would do. And it would be a single focused group. They don't deal with suppression, they're dealing with wildfire prevention, so that we have consistent standards for what that would be, that we would plan across the region. We could go after funding, whether it's grants or taxes or whatever, to implement it. And some of these cities are small, so they don't have the resources to do it. They could contract with this group. Other cities are like Oakland and they have the resources to do it. But what I see is changing is that we've got to look at reducing the risk of fire neighborhood to neighborhood, not just house to house. Sort of the Caltrans calls it, they're looking at the watershed, but larger areas, because we're at the mercy of the least prepared plot of land that's near us, because that's where the fire will go. And we have to work together to make sure that we are able to reduce the risk of the spread of wildfire.
Dorothy, I think we need to raise the issue of who owns this issue, because there's a simple answer to it. We all own it. And Sue or Marge made reference to this funding source that we had, and there was a vote to reestablish it. That vote, as I recall, failed by 60-some votes. We estimate that probably a third or less than a third of the people who now live in that area lived there 30 years ago. 1, memories fade, and 2, people need to be reminded constantly of the danger where they live. And so I want to bring back this issue of ownership. There are things that the city needs to do, the county needs to do, and the regional parks. There are things that individuals need to do as well. And one of them that I learned a long time ago is that you really have to put your money on the table too. And when that measure failed, I was mortified. $75 a year is $1.44 per week. Starbucks does not sell a small cup of coffee for that. So we're not talking about huge amounts of money, but everybody has got to have skin in this game, including the homeowners. These are minor, but this amount of money can go a long way. And if people have concerns, as Marge said about, well, it's going to go into city's coffers. Well, Marge and I know what happens to that. It can disappear in the ether. We can set up a system where actually the homeowners really decide how it's going to be spent, where it's going to be spent. The city would still have to approve that, but try to take the bureaucracy out of it. We need to be creative about how we deal with this issue. The question is not whether or not there's going to be a fire. There is definitely going to be a fire.
Yes. Well, you bring up the word ownership, and that leads me to another question. My memory of the fire, so much about the aftermath was about rebuilding. And I want to ask the panel, what were some of the building standards put in place after the fire? And were they adhered to? Marge, you want to take that?
We had a lot of difficulty in terms of building standards. Issues that I lost on, and I still feel bad about, but I couldn't get the political will to go with me much as I tried. Widening the roads. Charing Cross was the bête noire, shall we say. In fact, the irony is our new fire chief is living there. And I could not get the roads widened. The compromise I ended up trying to work out was getting in parking enforcement, which unfortunately now is not being enforced against, so that the protective open roads, because you couldn't park in those spots, it's not being enforced and not being protected. So that even the fire chief happened to remark to me the other day that the way somebody had parked on Charing Cross, he couldn't get out, let alone let a fire truck get in. Then also in terms of development, one that, again, we lost, and I throw my hands up in the air, the requiring sprinklers within a house to control internal ignition go out, lost that one. But nevertheless, we did win on a few on a statewide basis. One of those was getting the standards for building roofs, no more wood flaky things, shingles, thank you. And so we got some other code things built in terms of walls, wall widths, and fire retardant kind of qualities and that kind of thing. We also did a lot on insurance, but that's another matter you can talk about later. But these standards begin to do what's necessary, but don't do everything that's necessary. And the key is still got to be that we still have stupid things going on. For instance, someone, instead of totally rebuilding their wood roofs, their wood shingles, say that they just have to do part of it and therefore they can keep their wood shingles. They don't realize that with a little more money, they could put in a decent roof that would be fire safe. They don't think about it that way. They think about it as saving the money by just doing by expanding a little job, avoiding permits and everything else that way. And it's that thinking that's scary.
So I was going to say things that are changing is that, first of all, in Oakland, we're not a new community. So for us, it's not new. It was new development in 1991, but at this point, we're retrofitting houses. And what's changing because of the fires of 2017, 18, 19, 20 is that there's now coming into the vernacular the concept of home hardening. And in 2023, there will be a new standard in the state that the city will have to be inspecting for. And that is that the 0 to 5 feet around your house is supposed to be a no ember zone. And what does that mean? It means making sure that you don't put wood chips close to your house, that you use non-flammable stones or something like that, that you try to keep your plants low. They certainly should be hydrated. And as they get too big, you should take them out. But more importantly, you try to make sure that embers don't get a toehold into your house. So there's some things you can do to retrofit your house. Changing the roof is expensive, but fairly inexpensive is to add 1/8 inch mesh to the vents in your house. You can do that with a staple gun if you're handy, or you can hire somebody to do it, but it keeps the embers from getting through those vents. Constantly making sure that you don't have debris on your roof. And other things, so that if there is a fire, that the embers that come here can't get a toehold. And on that thing, another thing I want to say is that even though we get inspected once a year, people seem to think, well, I've been inspected, I've passed, I'm fine for the year. That's not true. You need to think about doing it at least twice a year, once before the inspection and again in August before we get to high fire season, where you walk around your house again and make sure that the plants haven't grown back and are now too close to your house. And when we get the warnings about red flag warning, which is high wind and dry conditions coming up in 72 hours, you go back and look around, you clean off the debris from your roof, you bring in your flammable stuff from the deck, and when it becomes a red flag alert, which means in 24 hours, then you got to get yourself ready in case you have to evacuate, which is a whole nother story. But the point is that people have to think of wildfire prevention and emergency preparedness as a way of life 24/7. It's got to be a mindset that just is when you choose where you live, when you decide what kind of plants you're going to plant. It's not one and done.
I want to go back to my ownership issue. One of the things that was readily apparent after the fire, I mean, almost immediately and to this day, is something that Sue said about the fire knowing no boundaries. But even where it stopped, it impacted the entire city. There was major, major grief, major disruption in our business, in the economy, in the loss of homes, in the rebuilding process. The entire city was impacted by that firestorm. And that's going to be the same if we have another disastrous fire. So when I talk about the ownership, we're all going to own the results of that. And so it's important, whether you live in the hills or not. Obviously, you're closer to it and you need to be more focused on it, but it impacts the entire city. And so all of us need to be thinking about what needs to happen so that we have a better response, less destruction, because we cannot control the winds.
And don't forget about the smoke. I mean, last year, remember we had those orange skies
Yes.
and terrible smoke, which they said it sort of wiped out
Yes,
all,
last
all-
April.
Yeah,
It was Lunar
the
Day.
gains we had made in reducing carbons went away with that. And it not only covers the whole region, that smoke was impacting people in New York because the winds blow it across the country. So our fires impact everybody. That smoke is hazardous to people's health.
And would be made even more complicated being that we're in the middle of a pandemic and already masked, but this time at least everybody has a mask now.
Mhm.
I wanted to talk a number of things, but certainly I want to get back to this idea of, well, it's not an idea, it's just a fact. We have a fire about every 30 years or so. And with that kind of regularity, are enforcement measures effective? Do you see? I mean, we have enforcement policy, but how much education is happening? I know there's always a big push around fire season, but with fire season expanding every, lengthening every year, it seems since, 2016 or 2017, where things are getting drier, winds are getting, as someone said, more wild.
To echo what Sue Piper said, a lot of people work on the theory that it's one and done. You do your vegetation management and you're done. Plants are growing constantly. As it gets later in the season, fuel moisture reduces, particularly now with global warming or whatever. The heat is making the fuel ready to go. And the fact that it needs to be repeatedly done. We go out once a year because logistically the fire department, and the inspecting division can't really cover it much more than that. So it's incumbent upon homeowners to police their neighbors, police themselves, to be part of these programs. All the information's there, it's all online, it's all defendable space. You can figure it out just by looking. A lot of people just don't do it. So we need to work on that. And then I think a couple of the speakers talked about how there's some large property owners, PG&E, Caltrans, different people who own giant tracts of land. So politically, we need to make sure the ownership is clear. As Henry Gardner said, it's an ownership thing that people realize we're managing all this open space. It's not a park, it's just land that's going to burn. We need to make it safe. We need to do prescriptive burning. So anyway, I'll get off this, but that's a lot of the problem, is just the vigilance doesn't appear to be there. And so we need to figure out how to get people to have a big bag of caring in their life when it comes to these issues.
And I think the reason you
because
see
there are certainly a lot more Hill residents than there are firefighters. So definitely they need to work in tandem with them.
If I can quickly add it, the one thing I heard after the Hill fire, and I was on a committee that went around and basically visited neighborhood groups to, basically say mea culpa, if nothing else. But everyone was saying, I never saw a fire engine. And, do the simple math. Look at 3,500 housing units and a department that's got, had 25 fire engines at the time. No, you did not see a fire engine. you know, it was a long time before you saw a fire engine, and it came from, you know, Santa Barbara or somewhere. So you're right. There's a lot more homeowners than there are firefighters.
So first of all, the reason we sort of see it every 20 or 30 years is right now our individual homeowners are sort of doing their thing, but you talk about those large tracts of land, and because of lack of resources or lack of political will, not much is done. I mean, I can point to the North Oakland sports field, which is right by the Caldecott Tunnel. It's a big piece of land right next to Caltrans, and then there's a private property, and it's filled with eucalyptus and Scotch broom, and much of it has not been maintained over 30 years. So over time, when you don't maintain it, even though you may have dealt with it 30 years ago, if you don't do annual or every few years maintenance, it grows back, and then you're vulnerable again. That's the first thing. And the second thing that I think people have to understand, when a wildfire comes through, you can't stop it. If the winds are blowing, the only way it stops is when the winds die down, because what wildfire needs is it's the topography, it's the weather, and it's the fuel. And the only thing we can control is the fuel. So when we talk about vegetation management and wildfire prevention, what we're talking about is reducing the risk of the spread of the wildfire or slowing it down so people can safely evacuate. It doesn't mean we're going to save every house. It doesn't mean that the fire isn't going to spread. It's going to, and it's going to be chaotic. But the more you know, and the more you do to slow it down and to prepare yourself, the better your recovery is going to be. It's still going to be chaotic, but you know, we do want to come back afterwards, and the more we can do before it happens, the better our recovery will be afterwards.
So I want to talk a little bit about insurance in this climate of fire, what seems like perpetual fire. Has insurance of homes in the hills changed significantly since the 91 fire?
A lot. Beginning right after 91, the city of Oakland actually got into doing state legislating on insurance, and we changed the structure with the help of John Garamendi, who was the insurance commissioner at that time. We changed the structure of insurance from being something that was really opaque to being a total explanation of exactly what you bought and what it meant. And Nick Petrus, who also lost his home in the fire, carried that legislation for us. The other thing that was very important right after the fire is that the citizenry really united. I was able to contact John Garamendi and make it clear to him we needed his help. And he said he would stand ready, and he did stand ready and come down when I asked him. And he held enormous hearings that allowed everyone to talk about their problems with their own insurance company and be able to form up around that. At the same time, we had the formation here in Oakland of something called United Policyholders. Initially, someone by the name of Ina DeLong created a units which were with all of the holders of different fire insurance policies, so that, for instance, you had a State Farm group, you had a farmers group, you had a whatever group. And that helped everyone to try to work for settlements with the help of Garamendi leading down the throats of the insurance companies, in effect saying, knock off changing all of these adjusters, knock off delays and tactics and that kind of thing, and get serious. And that helped a great deal.
Wearing my hat as a board member of United Policyholders, they were formed just before the fire, and their efforts here in Oakland really established their program of roadmap to recovery, which they use across the country for all sorts of disasters. And Amy Bach, who also founded this with Ina DeLong, says that, you know, the East Bay Hills were unique. We're highly educated. Many of us grew up in the 60s, so we were not shy about organizing, and we did. And so she built on that. And they, to this day, continue to provide almost 2 years worth of handholding of survivors of disasters, breaking down the process of negotiating with your insurance company in small chunks with experts, holding their hands as they go through this over 2 years, because it takes a long time, to help disaster survivors become whole, or as close to whole as they can possibly become. So lots of things have happened over the years as fires have occurred. The Department of Insurance, and with United Policyholders lobbying for this stuff, they've tweaked the policies. But right now we're dealing with an issue where insurance companies, which are businesses, don't want to take the risk with climate change and knowing that these fires are coming fast and furious. And so at this point, we only have 50 insurance companies that do business in the state of California. And you're hearing about more and more people not having their insurance renewed. And the Department of Insurance is working very hard to work with insurance companies to come up with consistent standards that will allow them to not just decide that a zip code is too much of a risk. If a homeowner or if neighbors in a neighborhood are doing things to harden their home and do defensible space, they should get credit for that. So it's a changing landscape. And I think we'll see some new things in 2022.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything to add about the insurance companies?
I would just say that Santa Rosa, I worked as a consultant with the city of Santa Rosa following the 2017, it was October 2017 firestorm. And the insurance issue there, how that was being handled was built on what happened here in Oakland in 1991. And that was proved to be very helpful to the homeowners in Santa Rosa to know that they didn't have to go one by one to deal with Safeco or with farmers with State Farm. And as far as I know, they've gotten a lot less pushback than they would have gotten if we hadn't gone through the experience in 1991 and organized around. And Sue's absolutely right. One of the things that was very apparent, the insurance companies didn't just roll over and play dead. They were resisting mightily in rebuilding these houses. But the demographics that Sue described, which incidentally is always the case, got the right results.
Well, to say something about it, the thing that was very clear to me was that we had a neighborhood of folks who had graduated from UC Berkeley as part of the free speech movement. And they were using all of the skills they had learned to shake up any institution that needed shaking. But there was one thing I felt good about. Right after the fire, I heard neighbors saying, well, we'll never get this through the city's permitting department, but don't worry about the insurance will just settle. Guess what? The city was ready to permit within about 3 months and began permitting very quickly, but there was nobody coming because there were no settlements yet. And a lot of the insurance didn't settle until about 9 months to a year later. And that actually, ironically, may have been a good thing because the fly-by-night contractors who weren't part of the local good contractors groups had left. And so we had much more reliable contractors and much less problems with, shall we say, bad contractors because they couldn't wait around that long.
You know, my father-in-law was a State Farm manager back in Kansas, and the advice he gave us was not to settle right away. And in our case, State Farm gave us the face value of the policy right up front within a week of the fire. I've never seen so much money in my life. And so we were able to move forward with the design and the construction. We had to go back and forth with the insurance company to figure out what the specifications were on our original house. And once you got that in agreement, then you figured out how much it costs to pay for wood and all those other components. but by the time we got to that, we were into building our new house. And so I knew what our contractors were spending. And so we actually settled about 18 months after the fire, and maybe 3 or 4 months into the construction of our house. And that actually worked out very well.
I had some bad jokes when I was a member of the Lake Merritt Breakfast Club, and it was disclosed that the insurance estimators had estimated our bedroom as 1 by 20.
What does that mean? Okay, I have another question, and then I just want to share some information about resources with our audience before I open it up to their questions. I just want to say something about the North Hills Community Association that Sue is very much involved in. During and in response to the fire, the community there started the East Bay Phoenix Journal, and it ran for a few years, and it was really helpful. We have a collection of it here in the Oakland History Room, and it was really helpful in letting people know, both Hill residents and other residents around our region, what was going on to kind of rebuild the hills, to mitigate fire and so forth. And I thought it was they did a really good job in informing Oaklanders and Berkeley residents of what was happening, how can we stop this kind of disaster from happening again. But there were so many challenges. I spent part of the morning this morning looking at many of the issues of this newspaper, and there were arsonists shortly after the fire. A few years after, there was an arsonist going around, as if people needed that additional challenge. ABC made a film up in the hills that was very disturbing and triggering for many of the residents. A film about the fire starring LeVar Burton, who's not the host of Jeopardy. I just want to mention that. And it's just a great paper, Sue. It's just a really good paper. I've put in the chat, speaking of resources, I've put in the chat the North Hills Community Association website, and 2 good overviews that were recently in our media, one on ABC News and one in the Oakland Side newspaper. And so I want to open it. Actually, I have one last question, and that is, given all of the really traumatic and disastrous fires that we've seen, particularly up north in our northern counties, do you feel that that responses to fires, devastating fires in rural areas are treated differently or responded to differently than an urban fire? Oakland's fire was one of the biggest, most destructive, most costly urban fires in American history, as is documented here in these books, 7 Fires, The Urban Infernos That Reshaped America, and Flame and Fortune in the American West, Urban Development, Environmental Change, and the Great Oakland Hills Fire. Gregory Simon wrote this one. Anyway, I just wanted to throw it out there because I often wonder who's helping people in the small towns and rural areas. Is the response as well coordinated, or is it more responsive, or what? What do you know about that? What can you say about that?
I know there are fire safe councils like ours all over the state. And actually, there are probably more of them in the rural areas than there are in urban areas. And they do a lot with education, and they do a lot with vegetation management projects. But But you know, just like anywhere else, it's a small percentage of people who are engaged. So, you know, we just have our work cut out for us.
Mark may be able to respond more directly in terms of what response looks like to the actual fire. But it seems to me that Paradise would be an example where the entire town was leveled. What was that, 2018, I think it was. Just almost a year after the fire in Sonoma and Napa. And I don't know, you know, in these rural areas, fires can, of course, sweep through those very quickly. They have nowhere near the density that we have. So you don't have generally, except for Santa Rosa, which, as Sue has pointed out many times, actually is not in an area that's truly a wildland urban interface, not Coffey Park anyway. But it seems to me that how those fires are responded to probably is different than one that happens in a highly dense urban area like Oakland.
You know, the difference is this. As we talk about, fires need fuel. And in the rural areas, the fuel is primarily forests. But I like to say, Oakland, we planted houses with trees. That's our forest. Our forest are houses. Houses burn hotter, I think, Mark, than trees. And when you're in areas like Oakland, we are densely populated with buildings, structures that will burn. That's why when you have an urban fire like the one in 1991, it becomes, you know, the statistics are awful. More people die, more houses are destroyed. The economy is impacted because there are more of us in a concentrated area.
Can I just?
Yes, Mark,
Go ahead.
go on.
Well, I was just to your question, the original question. And it's been alluded to a few times, you know, topography, fuel, weather, and the staffing of what can go put out a fire. If you're in a rural area, by definition, the fire stations are spread really far apart. And if you get a good fire start, you know, and the conditions are bad, it's going to tear through hundreds and hundreds of acres before fire crews can really get into position to start trying to nudge it. But it's so reliant upon the way the wind's blowing, the way the fuel is, the topography, and how much you have to save a community. So Mr. Gardner brought up Paradise. Paradise just happened to be right close to where the fire started, and the wind was going that way, and it took it straight through Paradise. And it's a neighborhood, you know, I've got friends who live up there. It's an area that was heavily wooded, very, you know, bucolic, little cottagey houses. And CAL FIRE kind of went there, and I went up afterwards and talked to a few of the incident commanders. They got in there quick and just tried to figure out, what can we save? We can save this strip mall, that's defendable space. We can save that school. And then this other area, we just have to try to evacuate it. And that's the problem now with a lot of these forest fires. A lot of fires, the one Oakland included during the firestorm, is you tie up resources evacuating property and letting the fire get a stronger hold on the whole area. So I don't think I answered anything groundbreaking, but it's tough. It's a challenge. These fires are burning hotter, the fuel load is heavier, and the weather is more extreme.
Yeah.
Thank you. I now want to open it up to our guests, our guests. You could put your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the panel a question. Any questions out there?
Well, can I say something about evacuation? Because we were talking about that.
Sure.
I mean, it's always been a concern, but I think with Paradise, it really became a major concern for lots of people. And the city, the county of Alameda is launching this concept of zone haven. It's a program where they have divided the county into neighborhoods that help the first responders figure out if they have to evacuate, which ones they should evacuate first. And if you haven't signed up for Alameda County AC Alert, you should know what your zone is, because you'll get an alert that says if you're in zone Oakland East 15, either you should evacuate or they want you to wait, because they don't want everybody to go at once. Our roads can only take so many people. But as I sort of alluded to earlier, you don't want to wait to be told. So I think that those of us who live in danger, in harm's way, need to know what we need to know in order to make the decision to leave. And it's important to watch the weather. You should know that East Bay Regional Parks has online data that you can access from remote weather stations, and they will tell you the humidity and the wind direction and how fast the wind is blowing. You can put that all together and decide whether it's time for you to leave or not. But the bottom line is that for those of us in Oakland, it's not like up in Northern California where the fire is going for weeks at a time and it's, eating up a lot of miles. Our fires do not start in Contra Costa County. They start on the ridgeline up where East Bay Regional Parks is. And if the winds are blowing, they will blow down the hill very quickly, maybe in 15 minutes. And so if you're waiting for somebody to tell you that the fire started, and that takes a little bit of time, and then to tell you to get out, 15 minutes is not a lot of time. And so it's better to look at what's happening and make that decision that I'm going to leave now before the fire starts, because I don't want to get caught in that traffic. And in 1991, when I had to evacuate, it was bumper to bumper traffic on Hiller Drive, which is a wide street. Somebody had to stop their car to let me get in. And it took me a long time to get down to the bottom of the hill. And then we all funneled into Tunnel Road. And if you all know Tunnel Road, at that point, it's narrow, it's divided. We couldn't go on Highway 13 because the power lines were arcing and Highway 24 was closed. So everybody had to funnel down to Tunnel Road. And that traffic wasn't moving. It was like big game day. And so when I evacuated, I went down the wrong side of Tunnel Road and then quickly turned onto Roble Road, which is a very narrow road, and I couldn't turn around, and people were following me like lemmings to the sea. And I was driving right into a grove of eucalyptus that had exploded into flame. You don't know what is ahead of you. You don't know if a tree is blocking the road. I just saw an article from 1991 that talked about where the 25 people died. They had a map and they showed where the 25 people died. And 8 of the 25 died on Charing Cross, which is a very narrow road. Mm-hmm. So we're not new developments. Our roads are what they are. They're not going to be widened. They can only accommodate so many vehicles at a time. And you don't want to be one of those stuck in traffic when you don't know when the fire is bearing down on you.
So Sue, I think you are addressing one of the questions we have in chat from Sarah about communications. Does anyone think things would have been different with today's communications technology? And you mentioned that, you could get these alerts, and you certainly can get them on your cell phone now, which nearly everyone has. So we thank you for that.
Can I speak?
Sure, you have a question?
Yeah, Sean Benetti. First of all, thank you for letting me join this thing. I happen to be at the time of the Oakland fire, I was a San Mateo fireman, and now I work for San Francisco. Hi, Mark Hoffman. I worked with you during the Oakland fire. But I was at the Oakland fire. I was at the Paradise fire. I was at the Santa Rosa fires. I've been to the Thomas fire down south. I've been to all these major fires. I've been in the fire service for 37 years, and all your points you're bringing up are all valid. They all have strength behind them. But when we respond to these fires, a lot of times the public, I was at the Oakland fire and we were getting people that had to get basically brought out by the police department because they wouldn't leave their homes. We still go to these fires where they're getting the reverse 911. They still will not leave their home. And it hampers firefighting efforts when we try to get up into small areas that we come from, San Francisco or Oakland or wherever. We go up to Northern California, Southern California, and the people, they will just not leave their homes. So that's one thing. But with all these major fires, there's also the political part behind it, which unfortunately has to be addressed, where CAL FIRE is like the municipal fire departments. We go out, and when there's a fire, we try to put them out. The US Forest Service, when they go to these major fires, they manage the fires. I was just at the Dixie fire for a month, 2 weeks, off 2 weeks, and back up 2 weeks, and heard from several different people how this fire was so mismanaged by the US. I was working with people from Tennessee and Florida, and we had a whole different concept of the way we fight fire in California. And it gets to a point where the mutual aid system we have in California is the best in the world. Number one, we can call for help and we can get as many fire engines, as many police department cars, anything we want within hours, minutes, whatever time it takes us. So that part has gained from the Oakland Hills fire, when again we were on smaller channels, we never really worked together. We now all work together as one, which is a huge benefit. So all that stuff has gotten better. But when the politics play into it, when we have these major fires, I was just at, like I said, the Dixie fire, and the politics were the ones that it burned 1 million acres. And there's we were in Greenville, the city that burned down, 9 days before it burned down. And there was no way, shape, or form that fire should have turned back around and burned that city down. So the stuff that Oakland has put together, the stuff that the OES, CAL FIRE, it's all beneficial. You will be better off when there is another fire. But as Susan was saying about Charing Cross and Mark was saying about Charing Cross, if you can't get apparatus up there, you kind of have to just go, let's get the people out, and you pick what you can make to be a beneficial gain. Because firefighters will go into anything, but then you have to look at what the risk versus the reward is. So I was in Oakland, I was on Alta, Agnes, Proctor, and we saved a ton of homes with one fire engine. And like Mark said, when the weather died down, the fire went out. If that weather would not have died down, that fire, as Henry was saying, would have burned all the way down to the bay without a doubt. Oakland did everything they could do with what they had, and they had all the help. I came off duty from my home with another person to help fight that fire. And there's just so much around it that everybody has said all the good points. Vegetation, topography, wind, it's all changed. And when you pack in an area up in the hills where it's tough to get apparatus and firefighters to, it's a tough game. It's a tough battle to win. So thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you, Sean.
Sean talked about how the people who don't want to leave. And there's a lot of good information about what you should do, but we've got to motivate people. And I'm going to put in a plug for the link that you put in here under the chat on the ABC News Oakland Hills Fire, East Bay, 1991. It's a 35-minute documentary. And it's the reporters from ABC back then talking about what it was like. And they just focus on how the fire unfolded. And if people look at that, they will understand you don't want to wait behind. You don't have that fire moves so quickly. And I think sometimes people have to see it, to feel it. Just saying the words isn't enough. And somehow we have to get from education to motivation to action. And
we have another question in the chat. If Oakland is a forest of homes, what does defensible space look like in a neighborhood with dense building construction?
Well,
0 to 5
most of the fires that start, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go on, Sean. Do you want to address this?
All started with so Alta, Agnes, Proctor. What's that?
Go ahead. I was saying just go ahead with your answer.
the areas where we were at in Alta, Agnes, and Proctor in that area, all the homes that were catching on fire from all the shrubbery and bushes and everything out in front, because it's called an area ignition. When it gets so hot, these things were just popping off. And when people have the tile roofs, yes, they're protective, but when there's a bird nest underneath one of the tiles, that bird nest is susceptible to burning quick. Next thing you know, you have an attic fire. So defensible space, you would almost have to have zero, or I mean, all the low level, when you talk about having bushes and trees and that, you would have to get rid of everything, because I watched buildings start fire after all the shrubbery around the houses were catching on fire. The houses weren't catching fire. First it was the shrubbery, then the houses. And we could only do so much, because at the time there was only 3 of us until we got more help.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
Well, that's why that 0 to 5 feet is very important. In Oakland, we have a 5-foot setback on the sides of the house. And that means that between you and your house next door, if there's 5 feet, each of you got to get 10 feet there. So there are things you can do. It doesn't mean that your house is not going to absolutely not burn, but you want to protect it. So don't put the wood chips there, put lava rock. Go through there and think about, if I have to evacuate out of the back of my house, what's growing that could catch on fire that might block my entry, and take the stuff out. People have to realize stuff grows, it gets old, it gets woody. It's not sacrosanct. Take it out, put something else in that's less fire prone, that's lower, and maintain it. Don't let it go. So,
and there are lots of pamphlets and websites that talk
Right.
about defensible space, talk about vegetation management. There are books we have here in the history room, and they're in every bookstore, about what are some less flammable types of vegetation that you could plant around your property.
Dorothy, I'd
Yes,
like to go
Marge.
back to evacuation if we could, which is
Sure.
the reality is that with the narrowness of the streets in much of the hill area, you can get a fire engine up if there's no parking. You can't get that fire engine up if there's a single car parked where it shouldn't be. And right now, I think one of the biggest risks we have is the fact that we are not enforcing keeping the roads as wide as they possibly can be, so that people can get out at least, even if a fire engine can't get up. And I think one of the biggest risks we're ignoring is that very fact that you literally can't have people come out and get a fire engine up at the same time. But at least if this roads are open, you can get people out. And I think that's one of our biggest hazards right now.
But then the question, Marge, is you mentioned enforcement. It seems to me, and we need to do a better job of that, but it seems to me that one of the things we need to do is to have that conversation with the people who live in that area. And Sue put up some of those pictures from 1991 of what happened when people couldn't get out. We aren't trying to beautify the streets. We're trying to keep you alive. And I keep going back to 2/3 of them didn't live there. And so I think where we have those challenges, that's where we need to have the neighborhood discussion about when the fire starts. Our interest is how you get to safety. And you can't get there when you've got cars blocking.
Oh, yeah.
One, your egress. And number 2, the fire engines being able to come up here. The first thing is to get out. We can build another house.
So there's this national program called Firewise USA that's sponsored by the National Fire Protection Association. And it gives you a checklist, and the idea is that neighbors work together. They do an assessment of hardening their homes in defensible space so that they can create a neighborhood fire break. It's a little work, but the Oakland Fire Safe Council actually is trying to get 10 of these Firewise communities established in Oakland. Marin County has about, 35, 40 of them. Orinda has about 27, and we're a little slow. But as I said earlier, the idea is to get neighbors to work together.
Yes.
And to make sure that your neighborhood is safer.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, Sue. I want to end tonight's program by thanking our guests, Henry Gardner, Sue Piper, Marjorie Haskell, Mark Hoffman, Steve Lavoie. Thank you all for coming. And I also want to encourage you to come in, especially those of you who were not here during the fire. Come and visit us at the Oakland History Center. We have 4 extensive special collections on the fire, one of which was donated by Don Pearman, who investigated the fire for many, many years before he died in 2008. And we have his collection as well as many others that include maps and government reports, photographs, dispatch tapes, and et cetera. But we also have mounted an exhibit commemorating the fire in honor of the 25 people who lost their lives in the fire. As we've mentioned before, it was one of the biggest urban fires in US history. The amount lost of property lost would total $2.9 billion in today's money. 3,000 homes were lost, 1,600 acres were burned. And I'm glad we had this opportunity tonight to talk about what we can do to keep that kind of loss, that level of loss and trauma from happening again. So I want to thank all of my guests and all of our speakers. And Sue's put something else in the chat. And thank you, Sue. There are a couple of things I forgot to put in the chat. Thank you for following up with that. And yeah, I just want to say there are lessons to be learned here, and hopefully we will learn them, and the city will be responsive, and the region will work with us collaboratively to mitigate some of these things from happening as the climate worsens. And yeah, anyway, thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you indeed.
Thank
Yes.
you.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
To commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Oakland-Berkeley Firestorm, the Oakland History Center has mounted an exhibit that highlights the causes, responses, and resulting mitigation of the 1991 Hills Fire. The exhibit will run through December 31st of this year.